everyone. I'm Lori and Alexandre, and I'm thrilled to be able to welcome you all to this evening, late afternoon event, Cultural Practices, the Arts and Democracy, a panel discussion about cultural workers and artists for strengthening an inclusive democracy. Before handing it over to the panelists, let me just share a tiny bit. As many of you know, Antioch Works for Democracy, which is hosting this event today, is a multi-month, multi-pronged, university-wide effort of education and action to strengthen an inclusive democracy. It's now in its second month. We've had dozens of activities, panels, keynote addresses, book conversations. We've funded university community projects, etc. Relative to tonight, several activities have actually connected to the topic of the arts, from readings from literature about identity, war, and democracy, to an upcoming Poetry is Democracy reading next week. Those were in collaboration with our MFA program. We have a dance movement and democratic engagement project with our dance movement therapy program. And tonight, we want to look at arts-based approaches to address the threats to democracies around the world, practices that can foster more just and equitable societies. I'm actually really honored and touched to have had this panel organized by my friend, colleague, and former PhD in leadership and change student, Dr. Tom Borrup. Tom is the Director of Graduate Studies for Arts and Cultural Leadership and Civic Engagement programs at the University of Minnesota. And he has recently co-authored with his colleague Andrew Zitcer, who is here tonight as well, a book called Democracy as Creative Practice, which I'm not going to get into, but that is what the panelists will talk about, and was sort of the genesis for this panel. They have put together tonight a discussion with moderator on questions and reflections and experiences about cultural work and democracy. And it's my honor to introduce the moderator for this evening, Dr. Bob Lake, Professor Emeritus at Rutgers University and a democracy scholar. With that, Bob will introduce the panel and lay out the format for our event this evening. Thank you all for doing this, and thank you all for joining.
So thanks, thank you very much, Lauren. I'm delighted to be here with this really wonderful and distinguished panel, and I want to welcome all of the people in the audience who I'm guessing are located in multiple time zones and geographic locations. And welcome to our discussion. As Lauren mentioned, the occasion for this panel is the recent publication release of the book titled Democracy as Creative Practice, Weaving a Culture of Civic Life. It's co-edited by Tom Borrup and Andrew Zitcer, about whom more in a moment. It was published very recently by Rutgers, and I encourage everyone, if you're interested in our topic and motivated by what the panelists have to say this evening, to look further at the book and pursue some of the initial comments that the panelists will present to us tonight. Tonight here in my time zone, maybe not in yours. I'll introduce our panel in a second, but first a quick word on our format for today. We have about an hour and a half for the discussion. We'll begin with a brief overview of the book by co-editor Tom Borrup, and then an equally brief opening statement from each of the other panelists. I'll then pose a series of questions for the panel that we've identified and discussed in advance. The questions will help us explore the intersection of art, community, and democracy. It'll allow the panelists to describe their deep experience working in and among communities, in artist-led efforts to build and expand a culture of democracy at the grassroots level. And if all goes well, as I hope it will, we should have ample time to open the floor for questions and discussion from our wonderful audience. And as we go through the program, you can post your questions in the Q&A or in the chat, or just raise your hand, and I'll call on you to state your questions when we get to that portion of the program. So without further ado, let me introduce our four panelists, all of whom are contributors to the book, all of whom have long experience working in communities, and I'm sure are excited about the opportunity tonight to discuss their work with you here. So you already were introduced, Lauren introduced Tom Borrup, co-editor with Andrew Zitcer of the book Democracy as Creative Practice. We'll also hear from Karen Mack, founded LA Commons in 2003 to leverage the power of arts and culture to empower individuals, build connections, and develop communities. She's author with Elizabeth Cho of Creating Our Next LA, Art Animating Powerful Congregation-Based Campaigns for Justice. Jeremy Liu is a US-based artist, community builder, and real estate developer, investing in transformative projects, places, people, and ideas through creative development partners. He's author with John K.C. Liu of Introduction to Place-Based Actions, The Unraveling of Democracy and Reweaving of Civic Life. And Lisa Jo Epstein is the principal artist, facilitator, educator, and consultant, as well as the presence-based leadership coach at Just Act in Philadelphia. She's author of Democracy is in the Making, Just Act's model for rehumanizing community engagement. So welcome to our panelists, and over to you, Tom.
Thank you, Bob. And also, I want to acknowledge Andrew Zitcer, co-editor, and in fairness, Lorian, Bob was Andrew's PhD advisor at Rutgers. So it's coming together of some academic folks here as well this evening. I just want to say a little bit about the book, how it came to be, some of the general ideas behind it. Of course, in our introduction, we talk about the plight of democracies around the world. And I just yesterday saw, and actually I saw it in a couple of different, I think they're reputable news sources, the Miami Herald and the Minneapolis Star Tribune, a story about 2023 was the worst year on record for democracy, according to an International Institute for Democracy and Electoral Assistance based in Denmark. Said it's the worst year in nearly 50, with sharp declines in free elections, parliamentary oversight, and voter participation. So we don't need to belabor that. We all know that we have these challenges in front of us. And we know that the timing of this book, I mean, we wanted to get it published this year, not to change the election in the United States necessarily, not to save democracy around the world, but recognizing that this is long-term work. This is something that people in all professional sectors and all disciplines need to think about and take as responsibility for how do we promote this idea of a culture of democracy? How do we make our daily lives and our interactions with people and our institutions and businesses and what have you, how do we exemplify democratic practices that then extend, we hope, to the larger democratic systems that we all depend on and need for the survival of functional communities in this world. And of course, many artists have been doing this kind of work for a long time. We didn't discover anything new. We're just trying to collect it, put a name to it, to promote it. And And in fact, in the foreword to the book by Mario Guard-Ewell, she describes projects and artists programs more than 100 years ago. It was a national network, but she tells a story about a small city in Wisconsin where artists were doing this work explicitly to promote democratic behaviors and culture and way of life in Wisconsin, which at that time was kind of a bastion of liberal democracy. We don't know what happened to Wisconsin since then, uh, but we hope to turn it around. And of course, Andrew and I were both very influenced by the community-based artists that we have encountered through our work throughout the years. Being inspired by watching this work and participating in this work. Um, and also by John Dewey's work from more than 100 years ago in thinking about democracy as a way of life, um, and building on this idea that he also wrote about as a culture of democracy. Um, for 20 years, there was a wonderful project in the United States called Animating Democracy. It's where Karen and I first met, I believe, more than 20 years ago. And so this work has been alive and around, and we hope to bolster it and to see it thrive in the years ahead. Um, and we could also look to great work in the field of cultural democracy, which is kind of a complement to or flip side of the coin of this idea of a culture of democracy. But cultural democracy is very much about democratizing culture, and that everyone has a, a legitimate, valued voice and cultural practices, and it should be part of the larger conversation in communities. So again, building on that kind of work. So the book itself was released on August 1st. There's 36 individual writers from 7 different countries and 16 chapters split into 4 sections, one about place-based actions, one dealing with aesthetic practices, and one about learning environments, and finally about civic processes. These are areas or arenas in which artists are working, and the authors who came in kind of fit very nicely into those categories. And each one of those 4 categories is introduced by an additional author, and some wonderful thinkers in our field. So, of course, there's so many voices that we would also like to have included in the book. I mean, it could be a million pages long. But there are limits, and time and reality came to play. But maybe there'll be a second edition, and we'll have more voices at the table at that time. So that's a little bit about the book and our inspiration for it. Bob, you're going to move us along.
Thank you, Tom. Karen, you're up.
Thank you, Antioch, for this, your work to activate your university setting and your students to really focus on this issue. It's such a timely conversation, obviously, and, really appreciate Tom and Andrew's work to uplift the role of art in promoting democracy. I am the founder and executive director of LA Commons, as Bob mentioned. I'm going to show you a few slides to give you a sense of our work. I founded the organization really based on the idea of creating more social capital in Los Angeles. I actually studied with Robert Putnam at the Kennedy School and wrote my business plan for LA Commons in that class. And really, I do think that, as we can see in, the national situation, that the lack of social capital or the lack of trust between people that unfortunately has been promoted and cultivated is a real challenge in, actually having a thriving democracy. I am based in Los Angeles, which is it's certainly a challenging city to for those connections to be made because of our size, because of the way people interact with each other on a regular basis, the diversity, it just makes it hard to build those connections that actually result in trust. And so our work at LA Commons is really focused on using the technology of storytelling as the basis for building those bonds, recognizing that when people share and receive stories, that is a process that, builds empathy. And at the heart of our work are young people. We really believe in the energy, the vision, the welcome that people often provide for young people as a driver of this work. Oh, my slides aren't advancing. Let's see. Oh, there it is. Okay. And this idea of having young people engage with their elders as they collect information that then provides the foundation for creating works of art that really speak to neighborhood stories. And, I think the challenge, particularly in the disinvested communities that we work in, is that people's voices often are muted. And so with these public art projects, we provide the opportunity for people's voices to be played in the public realm, for people to show up in those spaces, feel heard, affirmed, and to gain the confidence, across the age spectrum, but particularly young people to participate in the civic conversation, to be part of thinking about not just the creation of an artwork, but how do we improve our communities across the board and advocate for policies that are going to support that. Right as the pandemic was taking hold, we came up with the idea that this would be an opportune moment for people to envision the next city. Like, what do we want to see really in Los Angeles, and how can we use this moment to think about it? So we engage young people and artists to lead a process to engage community members actually across Los Angeles to actually think about their city and what would be ideal in Los Angeles as we thought about coming out of the pandemic. And art played a central role in that project. This is a sculpture that ended up on the Music Center Plaza. It was one in a series of public artworks that were created as part of this project. And again, people from around the city had the opportunity to share their vision. And then this was the culmination. And one of the significant aspects of this project, so we were partnered with LA Voice, which is a collaboration of congregations who advocate for improved conditions for people in Los Angeles. And so they were very excited about bringing art into their organizing trainings with young people and older people to enable them to connect with their visions, again, the creating our next LA model, and to actually create artwork that was able to be taken to Sacramento to advocate for policy. So the art that we made fed right into this congregation-based advocacy process. This is a mural that really, I think, shows In the neighborhood story connections, the representation that happens in these works and the power that brings again to folks that participate, young people, old people, seeing your story told in public spaces represents a very powerful model and an on-ramp to participation in the democratic process. Being able to speak and be supported in that is one of the keys of our work with young people to get them ready to participate in the democratic process. As part of creating our next LA, we actually had Yo-Yo Ma come and involve us in his program that it's called the Bach Project. And so he really sees art as a vehicle for bringing people together, transcending all of this division, and allowing us to work together to make decisions that will benefit us all. The shared understanding that culture generates in these divisive times can bind us together as one world and guide us to political and economic decisions that benefit the entire species. We are all cultural beings. Let's explore how culture connects us, can help us shape a better future. And this is a closing photo of Yo-Yo Ma with a young Tongva poet at one of our events, really inspiring organizational leaders of all stripes to engage with the arts as a way to promote democracy and a better Los Angeles for everyone.
Wonderful, Karen. Thanks so much. Now, Jeremy, you're up.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jeremy Liu. I am the founder of a firm called Creative Development Partners that does work that really focuses on place and the way communities interact with it. Really from a advisory, consulting, but also our own projects where we're supporting and doing projects that really build the connection that communities have with places. I spent many years running community development corporations, and in a lot of ways I like to tell the story of how that became my entryway into the idea that culture and the arts really play a role in the way people participate in the shaping of the places and environments around them. And that as a manifestation of the way, one way that democracy either works or does not work, the practice of it in local places is really the heart of where I come to this from. I'm not going to share any slides. I just wanted to start with the story of how I got into this work, and we can talk more with the panel. But I said the other day to someone that the earliest intersection I remember experiencing directly of the way a culture and place really intersect in a deeply either democratic or undemocratic way was a community garden in Boston's South End neighborhood, something called the Berkeley Street Community Garden. And at the time, we were starting to work with some of the elderly senior Asian American gardeners, elderly Chinese immigrant gardeners who were really growing some just incredible, just lush, green, vibrant, abundant spaces in this garden. And that became a place that they really had an avenue to shape and affect the way the built environment looked. And that's one of the sort of opportunities and responsibilities, I think, of the way we think about democracy and how it enables the changes in our life that we want to see around us. And the contention there was that there was tension in the way the garden was being managed. And so we started to see the contestation of the aesthetic and the way some gardeners were growing versus other gardeners were growing, and the clash of cultures that showed up in the way not only the gardens looked, but then also as you started to get into the understanding of how the garden was being managed, even the different cultural patterns of participation and decision making, and how people's voices were heard or again not heard in the process of deciding about how cleanup days were planned, all the things about what it took to actually manage this community garden. And from there, it really became an opportunity to understand how we could really advance the sort of democratic processes, democratic design, the right to the city in a lot of ways, the right to shape the spaces that we live in through the way people participate. And on the one hand, this was enabled because the gardening and the expression that they had in that garden was an avenue into a process of participation that they really weren't participating in outside of the garden. And so that became a sort of culture, and the way they farmed really was a pathway into that. On the other hand, it became a contested site where the demand to mainstream the way you garden as a cultural expression became a tension into, I think is actually really still reflective to this day about the ideas and things that we've just heard in the last 48 hours about how folks who come to this country need to, adopt the mainstream ways that, the US actually it really is the sort of in the background, but is yet a manifest culture all into itself. And so from there, it really grew out of that process of understanding how that was working into a long sort of body of work that has involved arts and culture and place making, placekeeping, and the way those are shaped and how participation really influences all of that. I'll leave with the idea that one of the biggest insights we have, and this applies, I think, to sort of the fundamental ideas of democracy, is that community engagement is one thing, community participation is one thing, but the community's influence is really the thing that we're all after fundamentally. Just like when we say, when you go to vote, it's not a symbolic act. It's literally a direct connection to the power and influence that you have. And so in the community planning world and community development, we've long since shifted and really advocate for the shifting to talking about communities influence processes rather than community engagement or community participation processes. Looking forward to getting into it more with you all.
Thanks, Jeremy. Lisa, Joe.
Hello, everyone. I'm so honored to be on this panel with all of you and to have this rich conversation. And just to use my 5 minutes here, Jeremy was talking about avenue of participation and contested sites. And I thought, well, I'm going to pick up on that because the story I wanted to start with was in 2015, after decades as a theater director, like traditional, my work wasn't traditional, but in a like theater in found spaces, but theater as people know it, and decades practicing as a facilitator and director of something called Theater of the Oppressed, which is a form of theater primarily for community organizers, activists, non-actors, to take the tools of theater and create interactive productions that are about the issues of injustice that they are living. And it's a catalyst for the participants who are in the audience to jump in and pursue the avenue of participation by practicing new ways of interacting with other people. So in 2015, I was invited by a city planner, the head of a community development corporation, the executive director of a humanities council, and the community engagement director for the mayor's office in a city outside of Philadelphia, which is where I'm located here in Pennsylvania, a city called the city of Chester. And this was my first step into working with people who were organizing that were not artists and didn't really think about art, but they wanted to build an avenue of the arts and develop a historic arts and culture district. And it was like a dating game because I was not, I was given a place at the table, but not as an artist. And as I observed the power dynamics around this table, I was like, I have a lot to say, and I'm just going to say it. And so I began introducing things that are near and dear to my heart, which is that relationship is the project. And it's not about getting a physical product, but really cultivating the agency of the members of the people who live in this community who have been disenfranchised in a small city that has been disinvested. And you are asking to build this fancy avenue of the arts. And so where are they? And so I began to interrupt the perpetuation of traditional community engagement practices and asserted the idea that we create a story engagement team of residents from east side and west side of the city who I would train to lead the project. I would train them to facilitate something called a story circle process. I would train them to harvest the data with their circles. And then I would also train them in improvisational theater, even though they weren't actors, so that they could offer a gift back to the folks who were in the room and using the form of theater as a way to validate and honor and recognize that everybody in that room mattered. And years later, when I working back in Philadelphia, and I'll show you some pictures from that project, one of the community members said, "This is the first time that we're not rolled over, that big organizations and grants would come into their neighborhood or the city of Chester and ask for things and inform everybody of what was going to happen. And people would give and give and give because they wanted change. And they were like, well, maybe this time it will change." And then it would never change because the money would end and that whoever that was would leave. They would helicopter away and everybody would be like, well, what happened? And I was simultaneously getting certified as a citizen planner. I was the first artist in the Office of City Planning that has a certification program called the Citizens Planning Institute, where I was also introducing all of the arts and story. So in a nutshell, I work in contested sites where community members have not been recognized for the people that they are and are not invited. And instead of inviting them to the table of the developers or the city planners, I came up with this idea of saying, well, let's build our own table. And I'm going to grow your capacity to be the leaders of the project.
Thank you so much for those brief intros, and thank you. I'm impressed at the discipline of this panel for staying within our time frame. I think the first time in history of panel discussions that may have successfully happened. You've given us a taste of some of the very exciting and challenging work that's going on out there in the world to bring together art, democracy, and community, and to build all three of those pillars in hopefully mutually constructive ways. The work that you're doing from Philly to LA and in between is enormously exciting and generative. It reveals some of the real challenges that make this work demanding and not easy to pull off. So let's begin with a set of questions that allow us to explore some of these issues in a little bit more detail. And I'll leave it to you in terms of who wants to jump in on what questions. So one of the themes that keeps going around in my head when I listen to you talk about art and democracy is a very simple one: which comes first? Which is the means and which is the end? When I hear you talking about art and culture as a method for building democracy, it sounds like art is the means and achieving or expanding or strengthening democracy is the end that we seek to achieve. So my question is, does it also work the other way around, where democracy is a method for producing art? Can art be democratic? How do those two dynamics work together or against each other? And how do we make that relationship work in practice?
You know, so much about democracy or central to democracy is freedom of expression. And so um, this idea that, you know, democracy creates art, it does because it creates the space for artists to express themselves. So often when you see governments that are authoritarian, you know, one of the first things that they want to do is shut down the artists because the artists are communicating ideas that they are wanting to silence. And so democracy is essential if you were going to have art that really, for me, does its job, and that's reflecting the voice of the artist, the voice of the people, and you know, the dynamism that that represents.
Jeremy, your metaphor of the weaving is a great response to this too.
Yeah, I was going to say that if one wants to situate arts on one end and democracy on the other end, I often think about culture being in the middle then, where in between lies the ways that and patterns of behavior and practice and expression that in the way they manifest actually shows up directly in democratic processes, whether it's um, a rich and vibrant culture of poll poll watching and poll monitoring for different candidates in some communities where generations on folks have been taking their kids and then their grandkids and now their kids are going to the same polls to help recruit and mobilize voters for their candidate. That actually is one of the ways that democracy and culture sort of really are very intertwined, right? And I think one of the the metaphor we use was how culture and democratic practice really weave together, and really understanding those is really, and how they do weave together is really important, because that's how we both understand where we need to work to strengthen, but also where we need to identify that the risk of unraveling is very, very real, because it has been sort of the processes have been deculturalized in some ways, removed from their context. I think that's actually some of what we see happening now. So I think I totally agree with Karen. I think there's a real underpinning for arts that democracy enables, and then likewise, as we've talked about, vice versa. But really, how we see them. What does art tell us about democracy, and then what does democracy tell us about art is sort of where the cultural piece comes in.
So Tom's and Andrew's book proposal really got me thinking about the word democracy. It's not one that I used prior to writing my article, because of all the trappings that come with the word. And I think it was Arnold Mindell, who writes about deep democracy, who said democracy without awareness is a form of tyranny. Democracy without awareness is a form of tyranny. And that really spoke to me, because without awareness of our capacity to relate to one another, to interact, without our awareness of our capacity to see what has been preventing us from interacting, the social power concept that comes with democracy by itself isn't going to solve the interactional problems that persist. So I don't know if I kind of think that the amorphous definition of democracy that gets floated nowadays is really like mistaken identity, and like we need to break up with it, but we need to break up with something that we didn't actually know we were not having in the relationship, right? Because for me, thinking about art, culture, and democracy, they shouldn't be pitted against each other. They each sort of, like Jeremy was saying, if woven together, we all rise. If everybody is given, I'm probably changing how you used weaving, but I'm thinking about the act of weaving and who has the threads and that are being woven, and who is at the top of the loom, if you will, right? So for me, it's like, how do we practice who we are as human beings in the world? And in my article, I talk a lot about how I think we're all civic artists. And if we're all committed to growing this thing called democracy, the definition of which we know not, then we are all constantly practicing and able to continue to re-see in new ways, particularly in my case, through applied art, story, and theater, what it is that we're doing. And in re-seeing, we can recreate. And if we can recreate, then we are a democratic movement. Right? Movement happens. Right? Everyone talks about art, and art, oh, it so moves me. Like, I saw that painting or I saw that dance performance, it moves me. But what about the structures that shape our lives, these systems that are called democratic? If they have prevented the majority that democracy says it is representing from speaking, then we gotta break up with it, right? It is our responsibility. That word responsibility. We have the ability to respond anew, so that we are growing through art. The capacity to organize together for what we are for, to vision what it is that we are for, not always speaking out against what we're against. So I kind of think that the word democracy is a firecracker.
Lisa Jo, when I read this question, when Bob shared it, I immediately wrote down, oh, Lisa Jo should just talk about devised theater. And I as you're speaking now, it makes me wonder, like, what would you call devised democracy? Is that what you're saying? Like, and just to make sure people know what devised theater is, you maybe can explain that. But the way devised theater, which I think you're the one who finally opened my eyes to what devised theater was to begin with. But is there an analogy you could draw from what devised theater looks like if you do replace the word with devised democracy?
I love that challenge, Jeremy. Well, I think about my art as relational activism, in the senses that I am invited to collaborate with non-artists, often who are activists and organizers, who are used to, like, handing out Narcan or doing something about the trash and the dumping in their neighborhood. They're not making theater, right?
But in the same way as they don't necessarily think they're making democracy either in those moments.
Oh, I would agree. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. And so in devised theater, just to give you all a little snapshot in the work that I do, working with non-actors, creating structures for them to name what are the issues that they are concerned about, what are the challenges to making change. And we do a whole sort of social power analysis and really dig in where they might not have. What does change require? Both of, like, our CDC, of our city council, of our mayor, but what does change require of us as each one as individuals? And that differs for each person depending on where they stand. And so then I teach them different theater improvisational tools, and they find their way. They kind of reclaim control of the theater process and make it their own. And there is a sense of, I mean, when you said devised democracy, I was like, what always happens? And I really feel so blessed to bear witness to so many groups of people who really start tapping into their collective well-being and interrupt their own default settings of the self as isolated, that there's like through the embodiment of their own stories and meshing with each other's stories and then sharing that with members of their community, right? There's like this beautiful magic that always happens. And it is a kind of like a form of devised democracy because there isn't a social hierarchy, right? And part of what they're learning is how to listen with their full selves and not immediately need to insert their own stuff, but to receive information, be moved by it, and then move together. And what comes at the end, they're always surprised. They're like, what happened? Right? And I love devised democracy. I'm going to write it on a post-it and I'm going to marinate on that, Jeremy.
So let me jump in here again and move this in a little, unfortunately, might be a kind of dystopian direction. You know, it's no doubt an understatement to say that the world can be a tough and nasty place. We probably see this even more starkly with the kind of political rhetoric that we're bombarded with every day on the 6 o'clock news and in the current political season. And as if things weren't hard enough, those kinds of conditions pose what I think are really daunting challenges for the strengthening or even the survival of democracy. And so my question is, how does art fit in to this picture? How can art and culture respond to these challenges of antagonism, polarization, conflict, even hate that are evident in so many places today? You know, we talk about community as if it's this rosy, utopian place, but things are really rough out there, and we see this every day. So my questions are what is both the responsibility and the response of artists for the production of democracy under these kinds of very polarized and conflict-laden kinds of conditions? Does every perspective that's out there deserve equal recognition? And even if and when we disagree with it? And how does an artist walk that tightrope?
I really like what Lisa Joe was saying about devised democracy. And I mean, I don't think that artists have a responsibility to do anything like except create their art. And that's not even a responsibility. They decide that they want to create art and then they create it. But the opportunity exists for us all to be artists. And I think that's what Lisa Joe is saying. I'm really struck by how similar our work is and just loving the way she's describing the work that we do. I mean, it's like, you know, engaging in art is like an animating force, and it's very powerful once people plug into that. And that is really what our work is about. Unfortunately, and this is why we have this crisis of isolation, we are slaves to systems and slaves to technology and slaves to capitalism. And so our light has dimmed. Like we are shut down. And so we are, you know, basically victimized by this situation. And if we can tap into, you know, this creative force, then the opportunity exists to push back on all of this, you know, all of these challenges of, you know, not trusting our neighbors and, you know, feeling like we can't pay the bills and, you know, war and all of this, you know, it is, you know, that's, I feel like stories are so important because in a society where truth is up for grabs, the stories are the truth. Like, we have the truth inside of us, and we need to tap into that to, create the reflection of ourselves that is the truth.
I mean, I'm making me think about stories and J.D. Vance, and he makes up stories that to some people then become truth and totally like disrupt communities and threaten people's lives. And um, so there's just um, a division between authentic stories and bullshit stories. It's kind of like, how do we um, discern which are which? I'm also thinking, and to add to Bob's kind of dystopian thoughts in this question about sort of the faux democracy or faux participation, and we're told by consumer capitalism, oh, if you buy this product, you're saving the environment, or these shoes are more politically correct than those shoes, or all of that nonsense that we buy into. And I mean, I shop at Target and not Walmart, but what does that make some kind of difference in the world? But so we have a lot of different sort of cultural dynamics and forces that we're dealing with, and changing ways of understanding and seeing them, so that we have a clearer picture of what reality is.
I think a group, the Design Studio for Social Intervention out of Boston, and their Social Emergency Response Center is a really important example of the way arts can, in these times, both help folks cope with the sort of devastating impacts of sort of how unjust and corrupt and racist and whatnot sort of it feels like things are right now, and also equip them to start to figure out how to like move to resist, to change, to cope with beyond just a personal one, but a social one. That's why it's called the Social Emergency Response Center. So that's definitely one folks should look up. And one of the things that you can do we hosted a social emergency response center at one of the Policy Link National Equity Summits, and one of the folks they had come was the Aram Hans Fuentes protest banner library, which is a really interesting way I think, Karen, you made me think of it, help people see that their fight is not the first time the fight. They have solidarity amongst and between communities that are different, but you can actually go look at the library of protest banners that folks have used, and so you're not crafting crafting new one brand new for yourself, or a message or a statement or a case making, but you're actually seeing how others have made the case, and you're able to borrow. And that's sort of one of these sort of cultural infrastructures for democracy that I think, just to point out, I think is a way to deal with that folks have been already created and have for long created as a way of responding to what feels like dystopian times.
Your question is vast, and as you all were talking, I was thinking about how the only way that I can respond is to say, get local and start with ourselves, because even within there's no preaching to the choir, because the choir always needs rehearsal. Right. And so for me, Jeremy, you talked a lot about being place-based. I take that in all the dimensions that is, and really think about how can the tools that I have as a theater creator and facilitator, how can they serve my partners in ways that traditional forms haven't, so that they can have those kinds of conversations where it's supporting increased participation in public processes that they would have been sidelined from, right? Even in the making of any of the projects that I do, there might be like the host CDC, but there is a community action team of representative stakeholders from across the neighborhood who are the ones making the decisions about how the project will go forward. So how do we counter dystopianism? For me, it's like, don't go out there, go here.
Well, I'll just add one. I think it's go local, but also be willing to experience other people's, put yourself in other people's shoes. I think we produced a film, experimental spoken word documentary called Many Fires This Time, right as the pandemic was happening. And it really was an attempt to really bring folks together around seeing how much more similar their challenges that they face due to the structural nature of again, inequitable capitalist social structures and economic systems and whatnot. And we had a spoken word poet, Michael Quest Moore from New Orleans, go to a Black poet, go to rural white Appalachia, go to immigrant community work in Oakland, California, go to urban Chicago, and really like work with local spoken word poets and community members to really dive into really understanding the way they understood the challenges that they were facing. And I think that helped. If you watch the film, you can see how there really is an ability to cross what others have said are things that separate us, cross those boundaries, and really work across those and through art to actually bridge those, because you're working in a different way. And he actually uses a lot of the theater of the press methodology and story circle stuff as well. So
okay, so this is really a perfect segue into our next question. I do want to encourage those of you in the audience who've been very patiently listening here this evening. If you have questions or comments, post them in the chat, and we will make sure that we have time to address some of your questions. So don't be bashful. I know this is not a bashful crowd. Let's see your questions, your comments, your thoughts in the chat, and we'll get to that in a moment. For now, so Lisa Jo says, let's get local. And that really is my question, right? So many, maybe all of the chapters, the case studies in the book and your discussions here today have been about programs and practices that tend to be very localized, right? In local, where community means local, means small scale, means face-to-face, those kinds of ideas of community. And so my question is, how does art and culture work at that scale? Is there something about the local community, the local scale, that is particularly generative or conducive or accommodating of the production of art and culture? Or simultaneously, does the working at that localized face-to-face scale impose limits or limitations on what we can do, how we think, how we can transcend local parochial boundaries, talk across spaces? Can art and culture be both local and global at the same time, and how does that work?
I don't think all art is local or global. But if we talk about this art that is very focused on, democratic process, democracy is a retail endeavor. And so, doing the work at the local level is a requirement in some ways. You've heard over and over on the news over the last few weeks, they've got to go to these small places if they want to convince people to vote for them. So I think that because of that, we are talking, and again, sort of referencing what Lisa Jo was saying, it's just that alchemy that happens, when people start to talk to each other and build that trust that is the foundation for the practice of art and the practice of this collective art and the practice of democracy. It has to be done at that level. And I feel like as we practice art, I feel like what Lisa Jo's doing, what I'm doing, what Jeremy's talking about in some ways is helping people develop this muscle, which is flabby right now, muscle of civic engagement. And so you have to do that, on the ground with people around issues that you care about. Like if most people, some of these issues just go right over their head. Like, what are you talking about? But, you know, that's why the economy is always the most important issue, because that's the one that's most retail. So, I think that is a real struggle. I would say one place where it's interesting that it is local and global is at the border, right? Like I'm thinking about some of the interesting work that's been done, in the San Diego, Tijuana kind of exchange. And so, people are engaging in issues that transcend the sort of everydayness of being on one side or the other.
Karen, I think Robert Putnam's bonding and bridging social capital ideas are kind of important in this conversation too. If you have too much bonding social capital, you don't have any bridging capacities. If it's too local, and there's no kind of outside conversation with other ideas and other people, it kind of goes off the rails, as kind of I think we've seen in some places. So finding ways to build both of those muscles of building of bonding and bridging at the same time it seems very important to me.
Yeah, I agree with that.
I think one of the obligations, though, is I think arts and cultural practices and sort of the broader work in that area can actually help with that, in that, food and other sort of cultural manifestations are often an entryway for people, both to be in solidarity, but also to explore the unknown and the different. And I think, we created this thing called the National Bitter Melon Council years ago that was literally designed to help folks grasp what was going on in their community at the Berkeley Street Community Garden in Boston, by going to a bunch of different restaurants in the area and trying bitter melon dishes that were not, and these restaurants were not Chinese restaurants or Asian restaurants. These are just everyday mainstream restaurants. And so there's a way of utilizing the art to really try to break through, the parochialism that folks can sort of, there's sort of probably the entropy of parochialism, right? Where we sort of entropy into that state. And then the other more contemporary example is Mosaic America's sort of atlas that is really designed to be a tool to help folks who aren't necessarily artists better navigate the way cultural communities actually manifest in the landscape of a city. And their atlas around San Jose is a really interesting example of that. So those are two sort of thoughts about that. And then the one sort of, I think you can, to me, the art comes in when you do something like the Poor People's Campaign, Resurrection City, where you go and make the local show up in a big national stage, right? Where you build you can actually move the creative practice of moving the local into a different locus in place, and really have it materialized in a place where you wouldn't expect it, and is a really powerful way of trying to think about that same ability to sort of break through that parochialism. I saw Andrew wanted to jump in on something.
Yeah, if you won't mind, I just want to first of all say thank you so much to everyone who's joining us today. Thank you to these incredible panelists, and to Bob and to Lorian. And I just wanted to say one thing about the book, and then one offering, right? So was thinking about this idea of virality, right? Mark Dussard, who's a colleague, was writing about the viral transfer of policies from one place to another in a good way, right? And so places learn from one another and they copy one another. And so what we're hoping to do first in this book is to bring into one place the work of people like the people on this call and people from all different countries and geographies around the US into one collection. And that's step one. But as soon as the book was done, Tom and I were like, but these people have never been in the same room together. So two is working to take this book all around the country and beyond, which we've been working our tails off trying to organize, and get many of these artists in the room together and with artists in their own local communities and activists. And then the third part is, what do you do next? How do you make this phenomenon viral in a good way, so that it's happening all over the place, and it becomes a new lingua franca around the arts and democracy, a new practice that is really an old practice. And my offering is just going back to what Karen said about voice and voicelessness, and Lisa Jo spoke to this too. It is so often the bravery of the people who are most maligned and oppressed by systems of power that use their art to speak truth to power. And I'm thinking of a local example and an international example. Locally in Philadelphia, a group of high school students at Northeast High School made a video podcast about art as a tool of social protest. And they spoke about anti-apartheid art, and they spoke about different forms of art. And in the end of the video, they talked about Palestinian street art, as a means of protest against the occupation. And they didn't use the word Israel, and they didn't use the word Jewish, and they didn't use the word occupation. They just said Palestinians have used art as a means of social protest, and their video was banned, and their teacher, who's part of a union, is being ostracized and possibly fired. And there have been school district hearings and organizations of parents who are trying to dox these students and silence them. And there have been rallies by, counter protesters saying, let these children speak and let these teachers teach. And I'll put a link in a minute. And then, of course, so first of all, the children, right, the youth that Karen was talking about are so important, in this conversation. And then secondly, of course, what's happening in Afghanistan with the literal silencing of women's voices by the Taliban is so terrifying. And women in Afghanistan are beginning to sing in public and record those videos and post them to social media at threat of death. And we need to tune in and attend to what it means when they sing, when they talk about art as social protest in Philadelphia, that this is really life and death stuff. This is not a game. This is not an academic project. This is urgent. And I just so value the conversation, but the conversation has to lead to action.
Yeah, great.
You really spoke to my heart, Andrew, when you said this is urgent and has to lead to action. And all of the work that I do, including the work that I describe in the book, is all designed as a way for the particular group or neighborhood to strategize action plans for making change. And so it's never just sort of like a performance in isolation or a series of story circles throughout the neighborhood, from in a soccer field to a church basement to a home, a center for elders. It's really about like, there is a reason that the art is being used, and it's for folks in the neighborhood who may have never spoken to each other, who might not speak the same language, to come together. And Tom said bonding and bridging, to bridge assumptions and differences that they may have had about one another, and recognize their shared humanity, and that their differences are the heart and soul of that shared humanity, right? And then come up with action plans that they can advocate for from city council or from a particular agency in city government. And like the students in the Northeast, the teens with whom I've been working around voting, they did a forum theater piece on the steps of the school district that was revealing their feelings about disenfranchisement and how they know nothing about civic education because they go to public school in Philadelphia. And if they had gone to private school, it would be different. And the school board members had to stop and engage with the teenagers who were sharing their voice through this performance before the school board meeting. And then all of the actors went and testified to the school board saying, we need a resolution passed that in all the public schools in Philadelphia, there is a curriculum for civic education. And it actually passed. And it is slowly, very slowly rolling out. But I just wanted to like really connect that to what Andrew was saying. And that it's like responsive to what the group really wants to shift in the oppressive systems that are keeping them from shifting.
Great. So Carlos posted this interesting comment on the chat. I think to summarize it quickly.
Bob, he had his hand up too, so maybe he could speak it himself.
Indeed, and just by way of introduction, I think that the question that you raise is about the values of diversity and complexity. I think there's some interesting questions there about working across diversity. But Carla, is there a particular question that you want to pose, or do you want to summarize your comment for the panel?
Actually, not quite much about the last comment, but like kind of responding to your last question about like, the art practice is going local and global. But like, first of all, thank you for like, Lisa, Karen, and Jeremy to share, the wonderful experiences and, the wonderful work that you've done. And I feel that the book itself, like, it's already a good manifestation of how how the local stuff can go global. But like, I think book is just one of the manifestation. Like nowadays, social media, it's a really a good way of, telling the world about like local stories. So, yeah, I feel that like, and I absolutely agree with Karen that, everything it needs to start from local, from the community itself. How to get people involved. And I feel that like art has, as I said, has the power of empowering communities. It has the power of, giving people voices. And also it has the power of like, healing, people's hearts. So I feel that like, about the local thing, it's more like, doing this, having this function, but how to like kind of expand that on the global level. I feel that like, pub, as academics, for example, like, it's good that we share like, stories, interesting stories and inspiring stories around the globe. And another way of like doing this can be like filmmaking. So art making about, the arts itself can also be a way, that's just my, to present my personal view. Yeah, thanks.
I think what he's saying is so valid. The idea of using the incredible, like both oppressive, but also, generative power of technology to build those connections. I feel like that's what he's bringing up for me is a way to connect the dots. So the stuff that's happening locally, we know it's happening all over the globe. I mean, this is not, there are no new ideas. So people are, being galvanized by art all over the globe. So how do those connections get made? And that's the pushback. You know, that's the opportunity for pushback. So it's very, very good point.
Seems to me we haven't given much attention to the issue that seems to be pretty much on everyone's mind these days, which is the issue of the economy, right? We live in a time when economic issues, economic problems, poverty, inequality, affordability, meeting basic needs are extremely challenging for a lot of people. And my question then is, so how does art and culture fit in to this scenario, right? I recently read a statement by Jane Addams, who, who started the Settlement House in Chicago in the early 20th century, when she was working in an immigrant industrial community, with trying to address the problems there. She said, this is a quote, "The settlement soon discovered how difficult it is to put a fringe of art on the end of the day spent in the factory." So how do we deal with that? Is art a luxury? Is art an essential part of life? Does it fit in when all of the other life pressing issues have been addressed, or is it central to addressing them? Is it only once we've solved the problems of economic equality and basic material comforts that we can have the luxury of talking about art, or does art come first?
I don't know whether art comes first, but I feel like we are all creative beings. And I mean, if you look at our basic function, it's a creative one, and that's to reproduce. But that urge to, you know, um, share one's soul, I think, is there. Again, the light just gets turned off by the systems that oppress us. I think about, so many examples of people who just, they might have been in the most dire circumstance, but they're making this amazing art that's now showing up in museums, actually. I was at the Venice Biennale, and there was a lot of outsider art in that context. It was all about marginalized folks. So, and what about the creativity that it takes to survive, when you are feeling challenged? The opportunity, I was just at a retreat with the amazing Manuel Pastor and Chris Brenner about solidarity economics. And, at the root of that is creating mutuality. And art is not, art is nothing if powerful in, creating that foundation that then supports people in moving towards an economic system that is more supportive of people, that is not about competition, that is about collaboration, that recognizes people's right to housing, to health, to all aspects of what it means to live a good life. And culture is it is essential, I think, to move us to that state, to activate people, to be able to push, for a better situation that really does value people and not capital, and not prioritize people and not capital.
I mean, and to build on that, Karen, I love what you're saying about this. And, if you actually look at the practices or the way people make the economy work for themselves and their communities, that is a cultural expression itself, right? All the lending circle work that happens in different cultural communities, and even the fact that there are different variations on solidarity economics is the Western American contemporary term for it, but have been practicing solidarity economics in their communities for centuries, generations, millennia, and that you can start to recognize the way that those. I mean, I think the work is to recognize the way that those cultural practices resonate with each other in trying to sort of advance a new system, right? That there are multiple communities that actually have peer communal lending circles now. Different immigrant communities from far-flung parts of the world have that, and have always had that. And so, how do we update our understanding of what it means to have a contemporary economic system that works for everybody? And this is why in the piece we wrote for the book, we call for a culture or cultures in all policies approach, where you're really trying to bring the lens of an ability to see the way culture manifests in every other dimension of life. So in that way, it's definitely not a luxury, right? That you have to be able to see all those things in every other dimension of life in order to design a future state that's actually going to work for everybody and ourselves.
I'd love to pick up on what you're just saying, Jeremy, and see the way culture manifests in other dimensions of life. The project that I talked about earlier in the city of Chester was called Chester Made, and it was, the impetus for it was this avenue, but a particular funding organization said, you need to prove to us that creativity exists here. This major funder said that to them. And maybe I'm paraphrasing, but that was the gist of it. And so much of what emerged in the story circles and the gift backs was, where are the dimensions of, what are the dimensions of creativity that have been here and flourished for so long, and now it is being heard and seen and valued in a new way because it's in this project, and the story engagement team are supporting their neighbors to talk about it and see that it is a form of creativity, right? Is creativity a term of luxury? One of the story engagement team members, who was totally transformed by being a facilitator of story circles and acting, he's like, when I was growing up, I was not given a space to even talk about my interest in acting. And here he was over the course of 3 months, just acting all the time. And he then went on to film school and got a scholarship. And he's part of that dimension of life that is not being recognized and valued and uplifted.
So I'm keeping my eye on the clock and don't want to overstay our welcome. Opportunities for very quick final thoughts from our panel.
Well, it's been a pleasure to be on the panel with these two wonderful colleagues, and just so much in common. In addition, learning so much from you. And, I feel that art and democracy are intimately intertwined, and, just look forward to continuing our practice and hopefully connecting to other practices so we can make a difference in this crazy world we're living in.
I'll just say I've been so impressed with the energy in this conversation and the exchanges and the new thinking that's evolving. That's so important, and I hope we get to do a lot more of this and bring in more of our colleagues and more people to this conversation. Thank you so much for being part of this.
Likewise, thanks everybody. And also just to say my dad's on the call too, who co-wrote the piece with me. He's
Hi, Jeremy's dad.
Karen, I was so impressed with that. Oh my God. I was like, boy,
Karen, when you were talking about Manuel Pastor and Chris Benner, it made me think about something that they wrote, and it might be in the book, I don't remember. Our ability to grow together may be fundamentally rooted in our ability to know together. And I really feel like this conversation has been one of those opportunities to both grow and begin to know together. And I'm waiting for part 2 of this call to happen because I don't live in LA, so we need to keep it going. Thank you.
So I want to thank our wonderful panel, our panelists, for this really engaging discussion. And yes, absolutely, these are issues that we've just touched on the surface of, and we need to continue to talk about and act on for a long, long time. Thanks to Antioch University for sponsoring this panel. Thanks especially to Tom Borrup and Andrew Zitcer for editing the book, Democracy as Creative Practice, Weaving a Culture of Civic Life. If you were interested and touched by some of the commentary in today's discussion, go check out the book, because there's a lot more there that we haven't even that we barely scratched the surface of. Thanks, everybody. Good night, and stay well.